Evolution is a term that's very similar to Retrain and is used to describe an upgraded form of a card that's similar to the original, either due to its stats, appearance, or name. And because of Yu-Gi-Oh's storied history, there have been a number of powerful evolutions that have all managed to see competitive play for their own reasons. So in today's video, we're looking at some of the best fusion evolutions of cards, what makes them so powerful, how they differ from their original counterparts, and how they've managed to keep the themes of the card they're based on alive. And starting us up at number 10, we have Millennium-Eyes Restrict, a fusion monster that's actually an evolution of an evolution since it's based on Thousand-Eyes Restrict, the fusion evolution of Relinquished. And while their effects are slightly different, they all have one thing in common. They all can equip an opponent's monster to them. But Millennium-Eyes Restrict actually works differently from both of its original counterparts. Instead of being an ignition effect, it's actually a quick effect that you can only use in response to an opponent's monster's effect, which allows you to equip any monster in your opponent's field or in the graveyard to it. And while it's equipped, not only does Millennium-Eyes Restrict gain the stats of the equipped monster, just like Relinquished and Thousand Eyes, but it also negates the effects of all cards with the same name as the equipped monster and prevents them from attacking. This means that if your opponent tries to Ash Blossom your starter play, you can chain Millennium-Eyes Restrict to equip the Ash Blossom that's not in the graveyard and negate its effects, making Millennium-Eyes similar to a Called by the Grave and stopping hand traps. As a result, for a long while, Millennium-Eyes saw a ton of competitive play in extra decks for its ability to stop hand traps. However, most decks weren't ever hard summoning out Millennium-Eyes. They were instead cheating out of the extra deck with instant fusion. That way, they didn't have to play the associated Relinquished Garnet and could just summon Millennium-Eyes out for basically nothing. And funnily enough, this is exactly why Thousand-Eyes Restrict also saw a ton of play, since it was a great going second tool that you could use to steal your opponent's best monsters. A play that has been relevant since GOAT format, since you could cheat out Thousand-Eyes Restrict with either instant fusion or using Metamorphosis on a scapegoat token, and it was so strong that Thousand-Eyes Restrict remained on the ban list until 2016. Where thereafter it began to see play once more, as it also made instant fusion a strong going second tool. In fact, both Millennium-Eyes and Thousand Eyes contributed instant fusion's eventual limitation in 2020, since they both happened to be really strong tools going second, and because Millennium-Eyes could stop a ton of interactions when going first. Millennium-Eyes keeps the original Spirit of Relinquish and Thousand-Eyes Restrict alive with its effect to equip an opponent's monster, but has managed to reinterpret and update its effect for the more modern age, and will likely continue to see some amount of play so long as instant fusion is legal. And summoned in at number 9 is Invoked Caliga, who, alongside Alistair the Invoker of Madness, Crowley the First Prophecyr, and Invoked Ogoides, represents Alistair the Invoker's descent into madness. Caliga can be summoned by fusing together a dark monster with Alistair the Invoker, and shares all of Alistair's stats except for his typing, because instead of being a spellcaster, Caliga is a beast. And instead of searching invocation, Caliga instead has an absurdly strong floodgate, which makes it so that both players can only attack with one monster per turn, and can only attempt to activate a single monster effect per turn. As a floodgate, this effect is absurdly strong, since you can just summon Caliga at the end of the turn after you've comboed off, so that you can lock your opponent only into using a single monster effect for their entire turn. However, in invoked decks, Caliga was never really used as the main game plan. He was a great option for decks like Eldritch Invoked, which rarely needed to use multiple monster effects in a single turn, but for something like Dogmatica Invoked, you'd rather summon out Invoked Mechaba so that you can be protected from common hand traps while you perform your Dogmatica plays, and so that you could use your monster-based interactions during your opponent's turn. But the reason why Caliga is on this list isn't because of its common play and invoke strategies, it's actually because of how Caliga was able to transcend Alistair entirely and see play in Virtual World. You see, Virtual World is a deck that's very capable of summoning out Synchro and Xyz monsters that have a level or rank that's a multiples of 3, with their levels 3s and 6 tuners and non-tuners. This gave the deck easy access to Ultimate Tzolk'in, which allowed you to cheat out Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon from your extra deck for free if you set a card, a monster negate which gave the deck a very easy way to beat Nibiru. But because the deck couldn't make Link monsters due to its lock, Tzolk'in was usually stuck on the field as a useless body after Crystal Wing was summoned. However, if you summon out level 6 Muddy Muddragon, you can use its effect to fusion summon with Tzolk'in, and because Muddragon can be used as a replacement for any specifically named material, you can use Muddragon and Tzolk'in to bring out Invoked Caliga. This meant that Virtual World is capable of ending on Caliga to floodgate your opponent into only using one monster effect, and with Crystal Wing, you could just negate the single monster that they have. Caliga's floodgate is strong, so strong in fact that even decks that aren't playing Alistair at all will choose to run it just so they can have access to it. And even in invoked strategies, Caliga is a great way to stop your opponent from being able to play the game entirely. And slashing at number 8, we have Buster Blader, the Dragon Destroyer Swordsman, the fusion evolution of Buster Blader that, like his original counterpart, is designed to counter dragon-type monsters. And it does it well, because while you control the Dragon Destroyer, your opponent's dragon monsters are chained to defense position, and no dragon monster in your opponent's possession can activate their effects. which means that even dragon monsters in hand become useless. This effect pairs really well with its other effects, as while Dragon Destroyer can't attack directly, it gains 1000 attack and defense for every dragon monster on your opponent's field or graveyard, adding to its already beefy 2800 attack stat. And if it attacks a defense-resistant monster, it inflicts piercing battle damage. This is quite the upgrade from the original Buster Blader, which just gains 500 attack for every dragon monster your opponent controls or in their graveyard. Dragon Destroyer keeps the spirit of the original Buster Blader alive by being an insane counter to dragon strategies, because while you control it, every dragon monster becomes pretty much useless. And as a result, whenever there's a particularly strong dragon-based strategy dominant in the meta, Buster Blader as an engine becomes relatively popular because of how Dragon Destroyer can just auto-win against some strategies. But the thing that drives Dragon Destroyer over the top is that it's even good against non-dragon strategies. You see, the way many people bring out Dragon Destroyer is with the graveyard effect of Dragon Sword Memories. This effect lets you fuse into Dragon Destroyer using a Buster Blader and a dragon monster in your graveyard. And the main way people put memories in the graveyard alongside Buster Blader is with the effect of Prologue of the Destruction Sword. This effect also lets you summon out a Buster Dragon from your extra deck for free, as long as you destroy it during the next end phase. And Buster Dragon makes it so that every monster your opponent controls becomes a dragon monster. So once you bring out Destruction Sword with the memories you sent off with Prologue, you turn all of your opponent's monsters into dragons and lock them out of on-field effects entirely, making it an even better skill drain that can turn skip your opponent's turn and allow you to OTK on the following turn. Dragon Destroyer keeps the spirit of the original Buster Blader alive by countering dragons, but the cards around it elevate that theme and make it so that it's always beating your opponent's cards by making them dragons, which is a really neat way of upgrading the gimmick. And at number 7, we have Naturia Exterio, an advanced form of Naturia Beast that's wearing Naturia Barkion as armor. And like the two cards that make up its whole, Exterio has a non-once per turn negate that's capable of locking your opponent out of using their spell or trap cards. But while Naturia Beast can only lock your opponent out of spell cards, and Naturia Barkion can only lock them out of trap cards, Exterio can negate the activation of both card types by banishing a card from your graveyard and milling the top card of your deck. This effect is amazing and has a ton of coverage, because it's capable of shutting down strong playstarters, going second tools, and can even lock trap decks out of the game entirely. But like Millennium-Eyes Restrict, Exterio is pretty difficult to summon out normally, since it requires you to fuse two different synchro monsters together, which means that you have to invest a ton of resources in order to make it. However, just like Millennium-Eyes, there are a number of ways that you can cheat out Exterio from your extra deck. One of the most common ways is with Cyberstein. This is a pretty hefty cost since you have to pay 5,000 life points in order to bring out Exterio, which makes you susceptible to being OTK'd. But with how strong Exterio's effect is, it's more than worth it, which is precisely why Tearlaments and Sprite often experimented with playing Exterio in their extra deck, as Sprite Elf made it so that as soon as Stein hit the graveyard, you had access to one of the most busted fusion monsters in the game. However, with the latest ban list and the loss of Elf, Stein has become a lot less accessible. But that doesn't mean Stein has stopped seeing play entirely, because with the release of gigantic Champion Sargass, any deck that's capable of making Spriggan's Merrymaker is now capable of searching out Cyberstein to summon out Exterio, and currently is being played in Spriggan's for that reason. But in less combo-based strategies, Exterio was actually used as a punish for when your opponent would try to clear away your back row. Because if your set Waking the Dragon is destroyed, you get to summon out any monster from your deck or extra deck, and because Exterio doesn't have any restrictions on its special summon, just its fusion summon, it meant that you could just summon out Exterio and potentially win the game on the spot. Exterio is an absolutely stellar fusion upgrade of its original counterparts, although it would likely never see play if there was no way to cheat it out since it's extremely difficult to summon otherwise. Still, it keeps the same theme of Beast, Barkion, and the Naturias as a whole and elevates it to a new level. And at number 6, we have Grapha, Dragon Overlord of Darkworld, the recently released boss monster of the Dark Worlds based off the original boss monster, Grapha, Dragon Lord of Darkworld. But Fusion Grapha is actually quite different from its original counterpart. You see, the original Grapha is just a great extender that you can special summon from your graveyard by returning a Darkworld monster, and has an effect where if it's discarded, its mandatory effect will activate and destroy an opponent's card on the field. But Fusion Grapha doesn't have either of these effects, and instead has an effect where if your opponent activates any normal spell or trap card or monster effect, you can then change the effect that they activated to instead cause the control of Grapha to discard a card. And if Fusion Grapha leaves the field by an opponent's card, you get to special summon out the original Grapha from your graveyard or banish zone, and then force each player to discard a card. Now, while Fusion Grapha's effects are actually very different from normal Grapha, both of its effects are actually really on point for theming of Darkworld, since they both discard cards for effect, which is natively beneficial for Darkworld monsters, which all have effects that whenever they're discarded by a card effect, they get to do something. But there's a slight difference between the way these two effects discard cards. The second effect is an effect that you activate which causes both players to discard a card by your card effect. But its first effect is more reminiscent of Darkworld Brainwashing, where instead of just negating an opponent's card effect and then discarding a card, it changes your opponent's effect to force you to discard a card. This means that when you discard another Dark World, it not only gains its effect when it's discarded normally, it also gains a bonus effect because it was discarded by an opponent. Bro now draws 2 cards instead of 1. Silva summons itself back and also hand loops your opponent for 2. And Snow lets you reborn a monster in your opponent's graveyard. This pseudo-negate has been a really integral piece to modern Dark World strategies. Because not only is it a great end board piece, it's a great way to play around hand traps because if your opponent does try to hand trap you with Fusion Grapha up, you get access to a bunch of busted Dark World effects by altering their effect of the hand trap of your choice. In fact, this effect is so strong that it's even been played in non-Dark World strategies like Tearlaments alongside King of the Swamp. Fusion Grapha might not share many attributes of the original Grapha, but its effects are very on-brand for Dark World, and have elevated into a pretty great rogue strategy that's seen strong competitive play. Burning the bridge at number 5 is Red Eye's Dark Dragoon, a fusion evolution of Dark Paladin, which in turn is an evolution of the Dark Magician. And like Dark Paladin, Dragoon also comes with a negate that can also be activated by discarding a card. But instead of only being able to negate spell cards, Dragoon can negate any spell or trap card or monster effect while destroying the thing that activated it and then gain 1000 attack. And that's on top of its strong protection, because while Dragoon is on the field, neither player can target it with card effects or destroy it by card effects either, making it an almost towers-like monster. And that's not all, because Red Eye's Dark Dragoon doesn't just carry the Spear of the Dark Magician with it, it's also a Red Eyes card as well, and keeps the Red Eye Spirit alive with its burn effect because it can destroy an opponent's monster and burn them for the monster's original attack, as long as it was summoned with at least 1 normal monster as a material. And if it was summoned using 2 normal monsters, you actually could use the effect twice. This made Dragoon an excellent boss monster for both Red Eyes and Dark Magician strategies, since it's relatively easy to access with their associated fusion spells, and because these decks already played either Dark Magician and or Red Eyes, Dragoon fit really easy into these strategies. But because of the way Red Eye's fusion worked, it also managed to see a ton of play generically in a ton of different strategies. Red Eye's fusion can use fusion materials from your hand, field, or deck, but has a condition on it which makes it appear unusable in most strategies. Because if you activate Red Eye's fusion, you can't normal or special summon for the entire turn, which gets to Dragoon, but not much else. But for a while, you can instead use the effect of Predaplant Verte Anaconda to copy the effect of Red Eye's fusion and fuse from your deck. This meant you weren't technically activating Red Eye's fusion as a card, and weren't subjected to being locked in out of your summons for a turn, which allowed you to perform your full combo before summoning out Verte Anaconda to end on a strong board that also happened to be backed up by Dragoon. But as well as Verte, there are a number of other ways to deal with the restrictions of Red Eye's fusion. Guru decks, for example, don't actually need to normal summon or special summon during their first turn. All they need to do is set Guru face down to the field so they can be later flipped up with Hidden City. This means that they can activate Red Eye's fusion from their hand for free and end on a Dragoon to be also backed up by their Subterror Engine and Floodgates, making them an excellent pairing that even managed to top YCS Lion, and an event featuring Tearlaments at full power. But as well as Red Eye's fusion, there's also another fusion spell which can cheat out Dragoon and gets access to each of its insane effects: Branded Fusion. With the Branded Fusion, you can send Fallen of Albaz and either Dark Magician or the Light Hex Sealed Fusion to either go into Lobelion or Albion to use their effects to fuse into Dragoon. And because Dragoon is so strong in the current format, it's become a staple in branded extra decks, and even force branded pilots to play at least a copy of Dark Magician in the main deck just to use it. It's definitely not as generically splashable as it used to be, but for any deck that can use Dragoon, it's definitely a powerhouse of a boss monster to have in your arsenal. Swimming in at number 4 is the double whammy of Tearlaments Kaleido-Heart and Tearlaments Rulkallos, the 2 main boss monsters of Tearlaments, who are fusion evolutions of Tearlaments Rhinoheart and Tearlaments Kitkallos respectively. A fusion summoned Rulkallos is sent to the graveyard. You can just special summon her back for free, which pairs well with its first effect, which allows you to negate and destroy a card that would special summon a monster, and then send a card you control to the graveyard. And it does all of this while also protecting your other Aqua monsters from being destroyed by battle. On the other hand, whenever Tearlaments Kaleido-Heart is sent to the graveyard, it also special summons itself, but then allows you to send any Tearlaments card from your deck to the graveyard. And then, once you special summon back the Kaleido-Heart, or if another Aqua monster is sent to the graveyard while you control it, you get to use its effect to target a card your opponent controls and shuffle it into the deck. During Tearlaments Tier 0 status, these upgraded forms of the Tearlament monsters were an integral endboard pieces that both heavily contributed to the deck's dominance. Kaleido-Heart gave the deck another way to fusion summon on your opponent's turn by sending a Tearlaments monster from your deck to the graveyard with its revival effect, and was also a great form of interruption removal for any of your opponent's cards. Meanwhile, Rulkallos gave the deck a great interruption that could stop haymakers like E-Telly, while also protecting the deck from common hand traps such as Nibiru, and the deck's biggest counters, the Bystials, since if your opponent attempted to stop a fusion summon with the effect of a Bystial, you could just chain Rulkallos to negate and destroy that activated Bystial. However, with the recent hits on the ban list, both monsters have become a lot harder to access, and have lost a considerable amount of power, but that doesn't mean the cards are terrible. In fact, they're one of the big reasons why Tearlaments is still playable as a strong rogue strategy in the current format. With the ban of Kitkallos, Tearlaments lost its consistency, because it couldn't use its on-summon effect to search and lost its ability to mill 5 cards for free, and it meant the deck could no longer access Tearlament Rulkallos. However, even though both of these are big losses for the deck, Tearlaments pilots in the modern era have adapted and can easily access both of these cards with the use of King of the Swamp. Because with King of the Swamp, you can substitute Tearlament Kitkallos or Tearlaments Rhinoheart when fusion summoning, which allows you a really easy path to both Kaleido and Rulkallos without having to jump through hoops. And with Rulkallos, you get a great endboard piece, but with Kaleido, you also get a consistency tool because its graveyard effect can send any Tearlament card, not just monsters, allowing you to send Tearlament Screams so that you can search for the deck's powerful trap card interruptions. It's honestly impressive how Tearlaments have managed to adapt despite the sheer number of hits the deck received. But thanks to its boss monsters and some creativity with King of the Swamp, it still manages to scratch the ceiling of competitive play. And saving the day at number 3 is Destiny Hero Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, the evolved form of Elemental Hero Phoenix Enforcer and the dark counterpart of Elemental Hero Shining Phoenix Enforcer. Unlike the original Phoenix Enforcer, Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer can be destroyed by battle, but if it's destroyed by battle or card effect, you get to special summon out any Destiny Hero monster from your graveyard during the next standby phase, which includes itself. So while it may not have the same protection as its original counterpart, its effects makes it likely to stick around. And it's especially strong when paired with its quick effect, which lets you destroy 1 card you control and 1 card your opponent controls, so if you destroy your own DPE, you can then use its graveyard effect to bring it back to the next turn. And that's not all, because just like Shining Phoenix Enforcer, DPE also has an attack modifier. But instead of your monsters gaining attack, your opponent's monsters lose 200 attack and defense for every hero card in your graveyard. As a result, this fusion upgrade provided hero decks with an excellent form of interruption. That was so good because it was capable of interacting with both monsters and spell and trap cards, and traded really profitably because you were always guaranteed to get your DPE back through the next standby phase. And it was really accessible all thanks to Fusion Destiny, which was capable of summoning out DPE using materials from your deck, which also allowed hero decks to seed their graveyard and extend even further. However, because DPE and Fusion Destiny were so strong, it saw a ton of use outside of Hero as a generically strong boss monster. And a huge reason for that was because of Predaplant Verte Anaconda, because you could turn any 2 monsters into a DPE, just like with Dragoon. But there are a couple of big differences between Dragoon and DPE, which meant that DPE often saw far more competitive success. The first is the Fusion spell, because unlike Red Eye's Fusion, the lock on Fusion Destiny only lasted for the rest of the turn after you activated and not the whole turn. So even without Verte, you could perform your full combo and at the end activate Fusion Destiny for a free DPE to add to your endboard, which incentivized running multiple copies of Fusion Destiny so that you were more likely to see it, rather than just running a single Red Eye's Fusion as a brick. And the second reason is the materials you use to summon them out. You see, with Dragoon, you're forced to play 2 specific vanilla monsters if you want to actually get use of your Red Eye's Fusion. But with DPE, you had a wide array of hero effect monsters that you could use to summon it, with the most popular choices being Destiny Hero Dasher and Destiny Hero Celestial. These cards both had beneficial graveyard effects, with Dasher being a free summon if you draw a monster in your draw phase, and Celestial being a pot of green if you had no cards in hand, which meant that your DPE summon wasn't just great interruption, it was also follow-up. In fact, these graveyard effects are so strong that Destiny Hero Celestial is currently banned in Master Duel for just how good it was with Fusion Destiny. Recently, DPE saw a lot less play due to the Verte ban, as well as the amount of graveyard hate that was available in the previous format. But with Fusion Destiny at 3 in the TCG, it's likely that DPE will one day make its resurgence again, even without Verte, just because of how strong its effects are. Constructing into number 2 spot is El Shaddoll Winda, the Shaddoll counterpart of Winda, Priestess of Gusto. But Shaddoll Winda's effect is nothing like her counterpart, because while regular Winda's effect is similar to something like Giant Rat or Mystic Tomato, Shaddoll Winda's effects are a lot stronger. You can only fusion summon Winda, and it can be brought out with any Shaddoll monster and a dark monster's materials. While it's face up on the field, it cannot be destroyed by card effects, and each player can only special summon once per turn while it's face up on the field. Although, like the original Winda, Shaddoll Winda also floats, because when it's sent to the graveyard, you get to add a Shaddoll spell or trap card from your graveyard back to your hand. The Shaddoll archetype in general is actually nearly entirely composed of monsters that are puppet-like forms of other monsters in the dual terminal lore, and as a result, every one of its fusion monsters is technically a fusion evolution. And by far, the most infamous 2 are El Shaddoll Winda and El Shaddoll Construct. And for a while, El Shaddoll Construct was the face of the Shaddoll archetype, since it was difficult to deal with and had an amazing on-summon effect to foolish any Shaddoll card from your deck, which made it so strong that Construct was eventually put on the Forbidden Limited list, and as a result became one of the first fusion monsters in the game to ever be put on the ban list, alongside Thousand Eyes. But in the modern era, Construct is at 3 and is a lot less strong now compared to 2014. El Shaddoll Winda, on the other hand, wasn't that strong back in the day, but as the years have gone on, its ability to floodgate your opponent out of the game has become stronger and stronger. especially because Winda is fairly difficult to out, because with just a single special summon, you have to be able to deal with a 2200 attack beatstick that can't be destroyed by card effects. And as a result, Winda's Floodgate is sought after. So much so that even decks that aren't Shaddoll focused are willing to play Shaddoll cards just to get access to it. Dogmatica Invoked is a great example, as the only Shaddoll card their deck plays in their main deck is Shaddoll Schism. But by using the Dogmatica cards to extra full of Shaddoll monsters from your extra deck, you can search Schism and have the Shaddoll monsters in your graveyard that you need in order to fusion summon out Winda on your opponent's turn. Meanwhile, a deck like Tearlaments is willing to play more Shaddoll cards in the main deck, and you'll currently see a list running Shaddoll Beast and Hell Shaddoll Hollow, because not only are they Shaddoll names to fuse into Winda with your Dark Tearlaments, they also have beneficial graveyard effects when they're milled. And as a result, Tearlaments have the option to summon out Winda during their own turn at the end of a combo, or on their opponent's turn if they get a lucky mill. But either way, you're stuck under Winda's Floodgate. Now, Winda isn't unoutable, and there are plenty of cards that can deal with it or its Floodgate fairly easily. But it's still a really strong way to stop your opponent from playing the game that's so good that decks are willing to play potential bricks like Shaddoll Beast or Schism just to gain access to it. But the next fusion evolution on this list has an even stronger Floodgate that ended up being completely banned from the game. And roaring at number 1 is Thunder Dragon Colossus, the strongest evolution on this list. Colossus is an evolved form of the original Thunder Dragon, whose effect lets you discard it to add up to 2 other copies of itself from your deck to your hand. Colossus, however, almost has the opposite effect, because instead of letting you add cards from your deck to your hand, Colossus instead restricts your opponent and prevents them from adding cards from their deck to their hand by card effects unless it's by drawing. And if it would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can banish a Thunder monster from your graveyard instead. This made it an absolutely absurd boss monster, especially during toss format, because it meant that Colossus, and by extension Thunder Dragon decks, could restrict the searching power of decks like Skystrike and Orchis all by just existing on the field. And because of its protection effect, it was genuinely difficult to deal with if you didn't draw to the right cards, especially because you're not going to be able to search for the cards you need. And what's worse is that against Thunder Dragon, you were likely to have Colossus summoned out against you every single game because of how easy it was to bring out. You see, Colossus fusion summon requirements just requires that you use any Thunder monster with the original Thunder Dragon, but its alternative summon condition basically lets you bring it out for free, because you can instead tribute a non-fusion Thunder effect monster you control to summon out Colossus, as long as the effect of a Thunder monster has been activated in your hand that turn. Something Thunder Dragon decks could do easily with the effects of Thunder Dragon Matrix, Thunder Dragon Dark, and even the original Thunder Dragon. But it's not just limited to Thunder Dragons, because in formats like Master Duel and the OCG, you can actually play Colossus without a single Thunder Dragon in your deck by using Nemesis Corridor. And Corridor fulfills both conditions of Colossus by itself, activating itself in your hand to special summon, and being a Thunder monster you contribute to summon out Colossus and lock your opponent from searching. Out of every fusion evolution, there's no doubt that Colossus is one of the biggest glow-ups in this list, with the Floodgate so strong that it was eventually banned in the TCG at the end of the toss format. And if it ever came back, it'll likely allow for Thunder Dragons to see tiered contention once again. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other fusion evolutions we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.